when Pastor Timothy George was a student at Harvard Divinity School, his preaching professor told a story of when the professor was a young preacher and he was preaching in Louisiana during the Depression. The preaching professor said electricity was just coming into that part of the country, and he was out in a rural church. It was a black church, and they had just one light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and that light bulb was to illuminate the whole sanctuary. The pastor said that as a young preacher, he was preaching in that setting when, in the middle of his sermon, suddenly the light bulb went out. There was a power failure. The building went pitch dark, and the preaching professor didn't know what to do. He stumbled around trying to figure out what to say or do next when he heard one of the elder deacons in the back of the sanctuary cry out, "Preach on, preacher. We can still see Jesus in the dark." When darkness comes to our lives, to your life and to my life, can we still see Jesus, even in that darkness? When the darkness of chronic illness comes upon us, can we still see Jesus? When the darkness of the death of a loved one comes upon us, can we still see Jesus? When the darkness of financial reversals beset us, do we still see Jesus? Can we keep our eyes on God and continue to follow and trust Him when we go through trials, struggles, and suffering? No one in history had more reasons to take his eyes off of God because of the darkness around him than a man named Job. Job had given to God everything. He'd given God his obedience, his worship, and yet God did not protect Job from pain and suffering. And it was the worst kind of pain and suffering. Job's intense suffering was financial, it was emotional, it was physical, it was spiritual. Job suffered in every way, at every level. And now over the next 2 weeks, I'm sorry we're doing Job for 2 weeks. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at Job's life. We're going to look at his suffering, his questions, his faith, and we're also going to look at the answers that he gets from God. We're going to do that next week. Now, as we look at the Job, let me say right up front that this is the one book of the Bible, the book of Job, that we are reading from the chronological Bible that's not in chronological order. And I'm still kind of confused as to why the editor of our Bible has done this. Many of you are using this Bible to read through the Bible as we read through it together, but the editor has chosen to take the book of Job out of chronological order and place it at this time in our reading. When in actuality, the book of Job should have been read in January, maybe January 1. Many scholars believe that Job is the oldest written book in the Bible. If it's not the oldest, it's one of the oldest. And they believe this, they believe that Job was written actually before the book of Genesis was written. And they believe this for many reasons. One, the book of Job is written in the most archaic Hebrew of all of the Old Testament. The book of Job doesn't mention the law or Abraham or covenants. And so many scholars believe it was the first recorded book of the Bible. And Job lived at the time of the patriarchs, at the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And isn't it fitting when you think about it that one of the oldest books of the Bible, one of the oldest books ever written, should deal with one of the oldest problems that we face? Why people suffer, and especially why good people suffer, why godly people suffer. This is a question that we have all asked hundreds of times. We've asked ourselves, we've asked others, we've been asked, why do godly people suffer? Why do children die? Why do some people find themselves confined to a bed of pain? These are the questions that are addressed in the book of Job. They're hard questions. This is a hard book. But as we look at Job and as we meet this man, we're immediately impressed. Because we find that Job was not only a godly man, but he was a very godly man, and a very wealthy man too. We see Job's devotion to God in his blameless walk with God. Job was such a godly man that even God himself comments on Job's godliness, on his righteous life. God himself says about Job in chapter 1, verse 8. Remember, these are God's words. He says, "There is no one on earth like Job. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." That's God's endorsement of Job and his character. And as far as Job's wealth goes, he was unbelievably rich. Back in that time, wealth was measured in the possession of land and animals and servants and children, and Job had them all. The Bible tells us that Job had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, a large number of servants, 7 sons, and 3 daughters. Job was wealthy. But what was amazing was Job didn't let his wealth lead him to pride or lead him to sin. On the contrary, again, the Bible not only says that Job's walk was blameless and that he was upright, but we see that he was a clean living man. He's described as a godly man in the Bible, as a man who loves his family, whose family loves him. He's a man of integrity, a man of faith. He's the kind of person that we would like to know, that we would like to be friends with. He was a good man. So Job loves God. He loves his family. He's doing right. He's doing well. And then, without warning, unbelievable adversity comes upon Job. He loses his livestock, his crops, his land, his servants, and all 10 children. And in the next chapter, in chapter 2 of Job, he will lose his health as well. And as a matter of fact, in chapter 2, we're told that when Job's 3 closest friends come to see Job, after he's been struck with his illness, he is so disfigured they don't even recognize him. That's how much he's suffering physically, on top of what we just heard in chapter 1. Can we even ponder the pain that he's in? The loss, the suffering? And on top of all of these losses that the Bible mentions, the Bible doesn't mention other losses because of losing his wealth and losing his health and losing his family. He lost his standing in the community. He lost his honor and his respect. And the Bible does say that he even lost the support of his wife and his brothers. It was loss after loss after loss. But what's amazing is that shortly after receiving most of this bad news, Job responds by getting up, ripping his clothes, shaving his head. The ripping of the clothes and the shaving of the head back then was a cultural way to show his grief. So he hears this information and he grieves, and then he immediately falls down on his face and he worships God. And this is what he says in verse 21. He says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." That's breathtaking, isn't it? To suffer at all of those levels and to worship God, to respond by worshiping God. How can anyone who faces these difficult problems respond like that? Think of Job's situation: bankruptcy, pain, 10 fresh graves. And he grieves, but he worships God. This morning, we are going to take a brief look at how Job was able to do that. We're going to discover some principles that can equip us for life's most difficult problems. And I would encourage you to find your outline that's printed in the back of your bulletin, and we'll look at these principles together. You see there's an outline with 5 points. And I want to say, before we look at those principles, I just want to say a few words that I believe